Nestled in the heart of the Swiss Alps, in a small village near Gstaad, lies a chalet that once belonged to the legendary actress Deborah Kerr. Known for her grace and elegance on the silver screen, Kerr found solace in this remote haven during her later years. But the chalet, now shrouded in mystery, has become the subject of chilling whispers and strange phenomena that locals and visitors have struggled to explain. The story begins in the late 1960s, shortly after Kerr purchased the chalet. Surrounded by pristine snow-covered slopes and towering pine trees, the property offered a serene retreat from the bustle of Hollywood. However, neighbors and villagers began to notice peculiar occurrences soon after Kerr took residence. On certain moonlit nights, strange shadows would appear on the snowy slopes surrounding the house. These shadows did not correspond to any visible objects or figures. They would stretch and twist unnaturally, as if cast by something unseen. Kerr, ever the pragmatic woman, dismissed the oddities at first, attributing them to tricks of light and snow. But the whispers were harder to ignore. Visitors and locals passing by the chalet claimed to hear faint, disembodied murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very ground. These whispers, unintelligible yet strangely melodic, grew louder in the dead of winter. Some described them as voices carried on the wind, while others swore they were more like the rustling of unseen figures moving just out of sight. Kerr, a woman of quiet strength, was not one to scare easily. She reportedly confided to a friend that while she heard the whispers herself, she found them oddly comforting, as though the house and its surroundings were alive with a benevolent presence. After her passing in 2007, the chalet changed hands several times, but none of its subsequent owners stayed for long. Some claimed they could not endure the eerie sensations of being watched or the inexplicable sounds that filled the night. Local folklore has since entwined itself with the story of the Deborah Kerr house. Some say the shadows are the spirits of ancient travelers who lost their way in the treacherous alpine passes. Others believe the whispers are the echoes of long-forgotten tales, carried on the icy winds that sweep through the valleys. Despite or perhaps because of its haunted reputation, the chalet remains a point of fascination. Thrill-seekers and curious travelers often venture to the area, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious shadows or hear the fabled whispers. To this day, the Deborah Kerr house stands as a silent sentinel, its timeless beauty hiding secrets as deep as the alpine snows. Whether the strange phenomena are the result of natural acoustics and optical illusions or something more otherworldly, one thing is certain. The story of the chalet continues to captivate the imagination of all who hear it. One particularly harsh winter, a journalist named Margot Heights decided to stay in the chalet to write a feature on its enigmatic history. Margot, a skeptic by nature, dismissed the stories of shadows and whispers as local superstition. Equipped with recording devices and a camera, she intended to document the so-called phenomena and debunk the myths surrounding the Deborah Kerr house. The first few nights were uneventful. The wind howled through the valley, and the snow piled high against the wooden shutters. Margot felt a deep sense of isolation but nothing out of the ordinary. On the fourth night, however, she was awakened by an odd sensation, a stillness that felt too profound. The wind had stopped, and the usual creaks of the old chalet were absent. It was as if the world outside had fallen silent. She stepped out onto the balcony, her breath visible in the frigid air. The slopes glistened under the moonlight, untouched and pristine. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed movement. A shadow stretched across the snow, impossibly long and angular. Margot froze, her heart pounding. There was no one there, no tree, no object that could cast such a shadow. And yet, it seemed to ripple, almost as if it were alive. She snapped a photo, her hands trembling. As she reviewed the image on her camera, the shadow appeared faintly, its edges blurred. But what caught her attention was something else entirely. In the background, near the edge of the forest, a figure stood indistinct and cloaked in darkness. She turned her gaze back to the slopes, but the figure was gone. The whispers began that same night. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the creaking of the wood or the settling snow. But as the hours passed, they grew louder, more distinct. Margot could not make out the words, but they seemed to come from all around her, echoing in the stillness. The next morning, she explored the area near the forest where she had seen the figure. The snow was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. Yet she felt an undeniable pull toward the trees, as though something was urging her to enter. She resisted, retreating to the safety of the chalet. Later that evening, as she reviewed her recordings, Margot discovered something that made her blood run cold. The audio from the previous night, taken as she tried to sleep, contained faint voices. One voice, soft and almost sing-song in tone, seemed to repeat a phrase over and over in a language she could not understand. Another was deeper, resonating like the low hum of a distant bell. Determined to find answers, Margot contacted a local historian, Dr. Lucas Vollenweider. When she described her experiences, his tone grew somber. He told her of a legend, one rarely spoken aloud. Centuries ago, before the village was established, travelers would attempt to cross the treacherous pass in winter, many of them never to return. According to the story, some who perished were said to have been drawn to the forest by whispers promising warmth and safety, only to vanish forever. Dr. Vollenweider warned her to leave the chalet before the whispers grew stronger. They say the forest claims those who listen too closely, he said. And once it does, they are never seen again. That night, Margot stayed up late, pacing the dimly lit chalet. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They seemed to form words now, but they were in a language she still could not place. As the hours stretched on, the voices began to take on an edge of desperation, as if pleading with her or warning her. At precisely 3 a.m., Margot's camera, set up to capture time-lapse footage of the slopes, began to malfunction. The screen flickered and then a single frame appeared. In it, the chalet was surrounded by shadows, dozens of them, converging on the house. At the edge of the frame stood the same figure she had seen before, now closer and more defined. The figure's face was obscured, but its hand was outstretched, pointing directly at the lens. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Margot's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the frame on her camera. The figure's outstretched hand seemed to reach through the screen, pulling her into its icy grip. She shut off the camera and paced the room, telling herself it was all a trick of light, a glitch in the recording. But deep down, she knew better. The chalet felt different now, heavier somehow. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and every creak of the old wooden beams seemed deliberate, as though the house itself was alive and watching her. She decided to leave the lights on, convinced it would keep the shadows at bay. Yet, as the minutes crawled into hours, the whispers began again. This time they were closer. The voices no longer seemed to float aimlessly in the night. They pressed against the walls, circling the room. Margot strained to make sense of them, their cadence rhythmic like an incantation. One voice broke through the chorus, a soft, melodic whisper that seemed to come from right behind her. "Come and see." She spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper repeated, softer now, coaxing her like a lullaby. The sound was hypnotic, tugging at something deep within her. Before she realized it, she had opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked toward the forest, drawn by the whispers. The moonlight cast long shadows, but they no longer behaved as they should. They twisted and flickered like flames, forming shapes that darted across the snow. At the edge of the forest, she stopped. The tall pines loomed above her, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The whispers were louder here, resonating from somewhere deep within. She hesitated, clutching her coat tightly, but then her camera beeped. She had left it running, still strapped around her neck. The screen lit up, revealing a new recording, one she hadn't taken. The footage showed her standing in front of the chalet, staring into the forest. She was motionless, but the shadows around her were alive, writhing and circling her like predators. Behind her, the figure from before emerged from the darkness, its face still obscured. It raised its hand and pointed toward the forest, the gesture slow and deliberate. "Come and see," the voice whispered again, this time not in her head but directly into her ear. Margot turned abruptly, heart pounding, but there was nothing behind her. The forest ahead was silent now, the whispers replaced by an eerie stillness. She glanced back at the chalet, its warm lights flickering invitingly. But the shadows on the snow told a different story. They stretched impossibly long, reaching from the chalet to her feet, pulling her gaze back toward the trees. She stepped forward. As Margot stepped into the forest, the air grew colder, biting at her skin with an unnatural sharpness. The trees towered above her like sentinels, their gnarled branches creating a canopy that blocked out the pale light of the moon. The whispers were louder here, surrounding her, echoing off the trunks of the ancient pines. They weren't just words anymore, they were shapes, twisting around her thoughts, urging her deeper into the darkness. "Come and see. Come closer." Her legs felt heavy, as though the snow beneath her was thickening, binding her to the earth. She wanted to stop, to turn back to the warmth of the chalet, but an invisible force pushed her forward. Each step felt inevitable. Each breath felt like it belonged to someone else. Ahead, through the thickening mist, Margot saw a faint light. It flickered like a distant lantern, far too steady to be the moon or stars. It beckoned her, a soft glow against the void of the forest. As she approached, the light grew more tangible, revealing an ancient stone structure, its stones weathered and covered in creeping moss. It was a shrine. A small altar stood at the center, surrounded by jagged rocks and carvings that looked almost alive, shifting under her gaze. At the base of the altar, there was a shallow pool of water, its surface perfectly still. The light emanated from the water itself, glowing with an eerie, almost hypnotic luminescence. Margot was drawn to it, unable to look away. She knelt at the edge of the pool, her reflection staring back at her, but it wasn't quite her reflection. Her image in the water was distorted, her face elongated and pale, the eyes hollow, as though drained of life. She reached a trembling hand toward the surface, her reflection mirroring the movement, but just before her fingers touched the water, a voice broke through the silence. "Do you wish to know the truth?" The voice was deep, ancient, and it echoed through her very bones. It was not the same voice from before, it was something far older, far darker. Margot could feel it pulling at her, unraveling the strands of her will. With a surge of panic, she pulled her hand back. But the pull of the pool was stronger now, as though the water itself was reaching out to claim her. The whispers returned, louder, urgent. They were no longer urging her forward, they were demanding something from her. "You belong to the forest now." Margot's heart raced as she stood up, her mind reeling. She backed away from the pool, but the light grew brighter, intensifying until it burned her eyes. A shadow moved in the distance, emerging from the tree line, and for the first time, Margot realized it was not a shadow at all. The figure from her camera, the one that had haunted her every step, was here, standing just beyond the light. Its face remained hidden, but its posture was unmistakable. It was watching her, waiting. Without thinking, Margot turned and ran, stumbling through the snow, her breath ragged in her chest. She didn't dare look back. Every step she took felt like it took her further from the world she knew, dragging her deeper into the forest's grip. The trees seemed to shift around her, their branches reaching out like arms, closing in from all sides. But as she neared the edge of the woods, something stopped her. There, standing in the clearing, was the chalet. She had run in a circle. The same place she had fled from, the same lights flickering through the windows, was now directly in front of her. But it wasn't right. It was different. The shadows around it were darker now, more pronounced, and the whispers filled her ears like a rising tide. She stepped toward the door, but it was locked. The sound of a heavy, hollow knock echoed from within, came from inside the house. The whispers grew frantic, a chorus of voices screaming in unison. "You shouldn't have come back." Margot's hand reached for the door, and the moment her fingers brushed the wood, a loud creak split the air. The door slowly opened on its own, as if inviting her inside. But there, in the doorway, stood the figure again, closer now, its hand raised, pointing at her, the hollow eyes staring into her soul. "You cannot leave," it whispered. Margot stepped back, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. The forest around her shifted once more, the trees bending toward her, their faces emerging in the bark, twisted and contorted, watching her with eyes full of centuries of secrets. And then, without warning, the whispers stopped. The world held its breath. Margot stood frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest as the door to the chalet creaked open further. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, its hand still raised, a silent command that seemed to pierce her very soul. The air was unnaturally cold now, and a strange stillness had settled over everything. No wind, no whispers, just the heavy silence of something waiting. Without thinking, she stepped inside, drawn by some primal force. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. The familiar warmth of the chalet was gone, replaced by a coldness that seeped into her bones. It felt as if the house itself were holding its breath, as if it were alive and watching her every move. She took a few hesitant steps forward, her eyes darting around the dimly lit room. The furniture was shrouded in dust and cobwebs, and the once tidy space now seemed abandoned, forgotten by time. But then her gaze fell upon something that made her blood run cold. On the far wall, there was a large, ornate mirror, its frame intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift when she looked away. The mirror reflected the room perfectly, but something was wrong. In the reflection, the shadows moved, as if alive, swirling around the room like dark tendrils. And in the center of the mirror, standing next to her, was the figure. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving toward her in the reflection, its form shifting and distorting, its face emerging from the shadows. But the face, it wasn't like anything human. It was an amalgamation of countless faces, each one more twisted and contorted than the last, overlapping in a grotesque collage. Eyes without pupils, mouths stretching wide in silent screams. Margot stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She turned to flee, but the door had vanished. The walls were closing in, and the house was alive, breathing with her, pulsing with an ancient, malevolent force. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as the whispers returned, this time with a ferocity that rattled her bones. "You shouldn't have come back," the voices repeated, but now they were joined by others. More voices, deeper, older, louder. Margot backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears, but she couldn't escape. The very walls seemed to be pressing in on her, the air so heavy it felt like she was drowning. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came a sound she hadn't heard before, a low, guttural growl, as if something beneath the floorboards was stirring, awakening after centuries of slumber. The mirror, still reflecting her frantic movements, began to ripple, its surface warping like water. She watched in horror as the faces within it began to move, their mouths opening in silent screams. One face reached out from the glass, its hand pushing through the surface, its fingers long and clawed, scraping at the air. Margot screamed and turned to run, but her legs wouldn't obey her. It was as if the house itself had taken hold of her, binding her to the spot. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body betrayed her, frozen in place. The whispering grew louder, closer, and suddenly, she was no longer alone. In the corner of the room, a figure appeared, not from the mirror this time, but from the darkness itself. It was cloaked in shadow, its body obscured by the blackness that seemed to stretch unnaturally around it. Its face was hidden, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice said again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a whisper, it was a command, a declaration. "You were never meant to leave." With a swift movement, the figure reached out, its fingers grazing her arm. The touch sent a jolt of ice through her body, numbing her instantly. A coldness so deep, so ancient, that it felt like it came from the very core of the earth itself. As the figure's grip tightened, the room began to warp around her, the walls distorting, the shadows lengthening and converging. The whispers reached a crescendo, now a cacophony of voices, a chorus of tortured souls. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the sound of something waking. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, a low rumble that vibrated through the walls, shaking the very foundations of the chalet. Something was stirring beneath the house, something ancient and hungry. The figure in the corner stepped closer, its form becoming more defined, its face finally visible. But what she saw only made her blood run cold. It was her face, not a reflection of her, not a ghostly imitation, but her exact likeness. A twisted, hollow version of herself, with eyes that were empty and black, like endless voids. It smiled at her a slow, unsettling grin and whispered, "It's time." The growl beneath the floorboards grew louder, deafening. And then, with a sudden violent shake, the floor gave way. The ground split open beneath her feet, the darkness consuming everything. As the ground split beneath Margot, she fell into the darkness. The house above her groaned and cracked, the whispers now an overwhelming cacophony, as though the very earth was trying to swallow her whole. She tumbled deeper into the abyss, her body weightless, her mind spinning with the sounds of torment and loss. Then the falling stopped. Margot landed softly, as if she had been caught by unseen hands. She blinked, slowly adjusting to the dim light in the space around her. She was no longer in the chalet. She was in a vast, hollow cavern and ancient underworld. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the weight of forgotten centuries. The walls were lined with countless faces, each one contorted in agony, their eyes pleading for release. They all stared at her, silent witnesses to the horrors that lay ahead. In front of her, the figure her twisted reflection stood, its smile never fading. It gestured toward the cavern's heart, where a glowing, pulsating light emanated from the depths. The figure spoke once more, its voice now a low, triumphant whisper. "It's time to join us." Margot took a step forward, compelled by forces beyond her comprehension. The whispers surrounded her, urging her closer to the light, to the truth of the dark power that had claimed the chalet. As her feet moved, she realized, with a sinking feeling, that she was no longer Margot, she was one of them now. A face in the wall, a voice in the whispering dark. And in that instant, the cavern echoed with the cries of the lost, the tormented souls who had come before her, and those who would follow. The cycle had begun anew. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.